Star Walker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. Hello, fellow gamer! Welcome to episode 123 of Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. I'm Lex Starwalker. On this show, we discuss the craft and art of game mastering. Not only do I pass along any wisdom I've gained over my 25 plus years of running RPGs, I also share wisdom from guest GMs and listener GMs like you. Every once in a while, I do one of these little bonus episodes. I plan episodes quite a bit out in the future, usually at least 6 episodes ahead of where I'm at. But every once in a while, something comes up and I just want to do an episode kind of on the fly that I hadn't planned on doing just because something happens that I want to talk about on the show. So I just got my hands on the new adventure for 5th edition D&D, Storm King's Thunder, and I'm still working through it. I haven't read the whole book yet. I haven't read through the entire adventure, but right away when I started reading this, I noticed some innovations in this adventure that I haven't seen before. And I'm really impressed with what Wizards is doing here. And I think there are some great things that a GM can learn from this adventure and apply to any adventure or session of D&D. So today I'm going to give some of my first impressions of Storm King's Thunder. I do plan to do a full review of the product at a later date. This is not going to be a full review. Again, I haven't even read the whole book yet. And I hate it when people review things and they haven't even read the thing. They're like, well, I haven't read the book yet, but here are my thoughts on it. It's like, I don't care what you think if you haven't even read the book. So this is just a preliminary, just some of my first impressions. And specifically what I want to talk about today is some tidbits of wisdom that I've learned from this book already that I think are going to help me be a better dungeon master and kind of shed some light on how to run this game and some of the nuts and bolts of running Dungeons & Dragons, specifically 5th edition, and kind of shed some light on maybe where Wizards is coming from as far as what they're thinking about how these different things work. So I thought that I would share some of my thoughts on these things with you today. Real quickly, I want to remind you I am still gathering questions about Primordia, my homebrew D&D world for use in future world building topics. So if you head to the show notes for this episode at starwalkerstudios.com, I will have a link to my post in the Google Plus community for Game Master's Journey, where I'm collecting those questions. And I'm just looking for quick fire questions about Primordia, either just questions about the setting or topics that you would like me to cover in future world building discussions. And the title of the post is Ask Me 20 Questions About Primordia or something like that. But I'm just collecting a bunch of these questions, and then I will use those to help plan future world building discussions.
This is Matthew Colville, and you're listening to Game Master's Journey.
Before I go on with talking about Storm King's Thunder, I want to give a quick shout out to the patrons of Star Walker Studios. The support of the patrons make this show possible. So if you enjoy Game Master's Journey and you'd like to give a little back, becoming a patron is a great way to do so. And patrons get some cool perks from the studio, like game material I make for Primordia and access to a special monthly podcast that I produce just for the patrons. I also want to give a huge shout out and thank you to my Tier 4 patron, Mr. Steve Strickland. Let's hear it for Steve. You the man. So thank you so much, Steve, and thank you to all the patrons of Star Walker Studios. And you can find out more about becoming a patron yourself by clicking on the Patreon button at the top of the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. So today, as I said, I want to talk a little bit about Storm King's Thunder, not so much about the adventure and the campaign, but more some little nuggets of wisdom that I've pulled from the pages of this book for just GMs in general, and specifically dungeon masters of D&D. So it seems like to me, each campaign that Wizards has put out for 5th edition has had some new innovations. It seems like every one of these, they try some different things that they haven't done before. We saw a lot of this in the most recent campaign, Curse of Strahd, and Storm King's Thunder is no different. And I've been really pleased with what I've seen in this adventure, just as far as things that aren't the actual adventure, but little tools and ways that they give to help out GMs running the adventure. So I want to go through some of this stuff. And so I made a list of some of the cool things that I've seen in this book that I haven't seen in previous adventures for D&D 5th edition. So the first thing, and this is a pretty big one, you notice it right away when you open the book, is in the very beginning of the book is a section called Dramatus Personae. I feel like I've asked for this. I feel like when I reviewed Curse of Strahd or maybe Tyranny of Dragons or one of the previous campaigns for 5th edition, I feel like I asked for a Dramatus Personae in the beginning of the adventure, and this one has one. So if you don't know what a Dramatus Personae is, this basically just lists all of the major NPCs in the adventure, and it gives a short description for each of the characters, and it also tells you where you can find more information about them in the book. So it's just really a cast of characters for the adventure, but these are really, really helpful, and they were very much missed, at least by me, in the previous adventures, because it's just a very easy way to help you as the game master to keep track of all the different NPCs and to be able to quickly find more information about a particular NPC if you need to. Another cool thing in this book is we have a few pieces of full spread art, which is to say art that goes across both pages, 2 full color pages, 1 piece of art. There's at least 2 or 3 of those in the book. They're pretty cool pieces showing giants and small folk, of course. And, you know, I've bashed some of the art in 5th edition before, and I stand by it. You know, some of the art is not so great, but these pieces are pretty good. This is pretty good art. And I have noticed these adventure books seem to overall have better art than especially what we see in the monster manual. I think most of the truly atrocious art is in the monster manual. The stuff in the DMG and the player's handbook is pretty good, but some of those monster illustrations are pretty bad. But I love these huge pieces of art. Not only are they just nice, you know, when you're reading the book to have this nice two-page piece of art to look at, but they're also nice running the game to have a nice big piece of artwork that you can show the players at some point without there being, you know, any chance of them seeing text or something that they shouldn't see, because it's all art. There's nothing else to see. So I really like that, and I hope that we see more of this in future adventures from Wizards, because I'm a big fan. I'd like to see more of them in the book. This adventure also uses the Milestone advancement method, which has become the standard for Wizards published adventures for 5th edition. I'm trying to think. Lost Mine of Phandelver did kind of a combination. It started out just doing kind of Milestone and just saying, at this point, the PCs should level. But then as you went further into that little module, it started going into having the DM track encounter-based XP. And then our next published adventure for 5th edition, Hoard of the Dragon Queen, kind of did the same thing. In the first book, the campaign was Tyranny of Dragons. In the first book, Hoard of the Dragon Queen, it uses encounter-based XP and has you tracking XP. It does state that you can optionally use the milestone method if you want. But then in the second half of that campaign, in the second book, The Rise of Tiamat, it's all milestone XP. So I actually ran Tyranny of Dragons. I got just to the beginning of the second book, and I found that really annoying because I started out using encounter-based XP, and then I get to the second book, and I'm like, oh, there's no support whatsoever for encounter-based XP. I guess we're doing milestone now, which was fine, but I would have liked to have been told in the first book that, oh, by the way, when you get to the second book, it's all milestone XP. So, keep that in mind, because if I would have known that, I would have just done milestone from the beginning. And then Princes of the Apocalypse, I'm not sure about. Out of the Abyss, I'm not sure about, because I don't actually have those two. I've read through them, but I don't own them. However, Curse of Strahd was milestone XP, and now Storm King's Thunder is milestone XP. So this seems to be the standard now, which I'm all for. You can go through the archives of Game Master's Journey and witness firsthand my transition from being someone who was all about encounter-based XP and tracking XP for every encounter, and that was the way I preferred, to being converted over to preferring the milestone XP method. I just think that the way 5th edition is built, milestone just works better. I think using the encounter-based XP is just opening a whole can of troubles for yourself as DM with no real upside, no payoff to it. So again, you can check out previous episodes of the show if you want to know more about my thoughts on that. So again, this is using milestone advancement. However, it's even more simplified and streamlined in this adventure compared to what we saw in Curse of Strahd. I did a review of Curse of Strahd. I'm a big fan of Curse of Strahd, but one of my criticisms of that adventure was that the milestones were not defined. You were given some examples, and that was it. And there's been a lot of disagreement online between different DMs who have different ideas of what the milestones should be and even how many milestones there should be. And I put up a blog post sharing my milestones that I'm using for my campaign. And I've gotten all kinds of comments from people who disagree, one reason or another, with how I did my milestones. So it's nice that in this adventure, we don't have that problem. It's very clearly stated. These are the points where the PCs gain a level. And again, like Curse of Strahd, it's using the variant of the milestone XP where each milestone is effectively gaining a level. So, a lot of people, I think, tend to think that this is the default way the milestone works, probably because that's the way Wizards does it in their products. But when you look at the explanation of using milestone XP in the Dungeon Master's Guide, the way it's explained is actually, you set up major and minor milestones and you give them different XP amounts, and it takes multiple milestones to gain the level. But then an optional way to do it is just saying there's one milestone, and when you hit that milestone, you gain a level. And that's what this adventure does. Also, this adventure has an adventure flowchart, which I believe is the first time we've seen this in one of these adventures. Yes, please and thank you, and don't ever not put an adventure flowchart in an adventure again, Wizards of the Coast. Thank you very much. This is just one of those things. I guess, they say hindsight is 20/20. It's one of those things, you see this in here and you're like, obviously this has to be here. And why on earth was it not always part of an adventure to have a flowchart? So this just helps you, if you're running the adventure, to see in one glance kind of the structure of the campaign and be able to tell where you're at, kind of where you've been and where you're going, and shows how it all connects together. And that's especially useful in this campaign because although the campaign is actually very linear, as it kind of has to be as a published campaign, there are different branching off points, and there are points in the campaign where you have a few different ways you could go. And so this flowchart really helps you kind of keep track of all that. So it's very useful. We also have a section in the book called Deadly Encounters. And this is really interesting. I'm actually going to read this to you. Many of the encounters in this adventure are deadly by design. They test the player's ability to make smart, informed decisions under pressure. A deadly encounter might be the only encounter the characters have on a given day and assumes the party is at full strength. or it might be so overwhelming that the characters are expected to avoid combat at all costs. So this is pretty cool. First of all, I'm glad that they're spelling this out, because a lot of dungeon masters, myself included, if they didn't spell this out, would be a little unsure of how to proceed, because we would look at the encounters and be like, wow, these encounters seem a little overpowered for where their player characters are. Is this by design? Was this a mistake? Do I need to, quote, fix this somehow or run it as written? Kind of what are the designers thinking here? What do I do? So I'm really glad that they spelled this out. It makes me wonder, though, is this something different for Storm King's Thunder? Are they spelling this out because, unlike previous adventures we've published, this adventure has deadly encounters? Or has this kind of been the way all or some or most of the adventures in the past have been, and it was just an assumption that they weren't sharing with us, and they've noticed confusion and we're like, you know what, we need to spell out that these encounters are, as deadly as they are by design, and we are intentionally, quote, breaking our encounter balancing system and making encounters that are on paper way too hard. And these are the reasons why we're doing it. Because I know I've discussed on this show confusion with encounters in Tyranny of Dragons and Curse of Strahd as just two examples that seemed, not properly balanced for the level that they were at, and wondering why that was. And I know I'm not the only one who's wondered that or discussed that on a podcast or a blog or whatever. So I'm really curious, is this something new and unique for Storm King's Thunder, or has this kind of always been the case and they're just now kind of spelling it out to us because they've realized that people were confused by it? That'd be a nice thing to know. There are also in this section guidelines for what to do if a TPK happens, a total party kill, where all the player characters get killed. Because obviously, if we're making an adventure with lots of deadly encounters, that's a very real possibility. I mean, as Wizards said, the intent and the hope is that the players will rise to the challenge and realize that, hey, these encounters are really deadly. We can't just run in foaming at the mouth, swinging our swords willy-nilly. We need to be tactical and strategic, and, maybe there's some fights we should just avoid, or maybe we need to get some allies or something. So that's all well and good, but still, there's a very real chance that a TPK could happen. So they give you some thoughts on what to do if a TPK happens, how to keep the campaign going. No, this doesn't mean it's the end of the campaign for you and your group. And that's pretty cool. And in Curse of Strahd, we had some guidelines given for what to do if an individual character dies, which I thought was really cool. So Curse of Strahd, I feel like was the first time I saw in one of these adventures for 5th edition. Here's what to do if a character dies. And now Storm King's Thunder, I feel like is the first time I'm seeing, here's what to do if the whole party dies. So I'm hoping in future adventures that Wizards puts out that they have both of those in there. Because although this tells you some ways to handle a TPK, it doesn't really say anything about what to do if just one player character dies. And Ravenloft vice versa. So I would really like to see in future adventures that they all tell you, here's some ideas what to do if a single PC dies, and here are some ideas what to do if all the PCs die. I think like a flowchart, that should just be a requisite part of all adventures going forward. Now we have a whole section on treasure, and this is probably the number one section that made me want to make this episode today, because it was a real eye-opener for me. Kind of obvious stuff. Again, everything's obvious once it's out there and you're looking back. It seems very obvious. That whole hindsight is 2020 thing seems very obvious now, but are not things that I really thought of before I saw in this book, and just really kind of opened my eyes on some different ways to approach treasure in the future. So first of all, we have some discussion of random coin amounts. So if you're using random treasure tables in the DMG, whether in a published adventure or your own adventure, there are individual treasure tables for you loot one ogre or something, or one hobgoblin. What's he got in his pockets? There are tables for that. And then there are lair tables for, you loot the goblin cave systems and this is all their accumulated treasure. Or you loot a dragon's hoard, that kind of thing. So you have two separate types of treasure tables, which I really like. And on both of those, you can roll for random coin amounts. So like 3d6 gold pieces or something like that. So one thing that's suggested in this book that I thought was pretty cool is that instead of rolling for those coins, you can, as a DM, instead choose an amount within that range. So let's say it's 3d6 gold pieces, right? So that means the player characters could find anything from 3 to 18 gold pieces. So I could roll 3d6 to see how many they find, or I could just choose a number between 3 and 18, right? The kind of the eye-opener, I mean, that's obvious. I didn't need anyone to tell me that. But the eye-opener here for me was the suggestion that you can kind of take into account where your player characters are as far as loot that they've accumulated this far in the campaign. So if, for instance, your player characters have a lot of loot and they have more loot than what they know what to do with, and they have more money than what they know what to do with, then you could just use that minimum amount. So if we're talking 3d6 gold pieces, I could just say you find 3 gold pieces because they already have tons of loot. They don't really need more loot. They're still finding something. I'm not completely ripping them off and saying, nope, no gold. This guy was penniless. I'm just taking that minimum amount. If, on the other hand, they're light on treasure, maybe they haven't found a lot of treasure yet, and I feel like they're not quite where they need to be at this point treasure-wise, then you could either, instead of rolling, use the average, which, let's see, average for 3d6 would be, 10 and a half, I think? So 10 or 11 gold. Or you could give them the maximum amount, which in our example of 3d6 gold pieces would be 18 gold. So I thought that was really cool. And isn't going to be as big a deal with the individual treasures because those are usually pretty small amounts. In that case, I would probably just pick a number in the range and not stress too much about it. But this can be really useful with the lair treasures where sometimes you're talking thousands of coins and it can be a lot of dice to roll. It can eat up some time, especially if you're coming up with it during the session. And more importantly, this is an opportunity for you to kind of adjust where the player characters are at as far as how much money do they have access to. So if you feel like they don't have enough, you can give them the average or the maximum amount from that treasure for coins instead of rolling. Or if you feel like they have too much, then you can give them the minimum amount. And I thought that was pretty cool. And again, something you can use in any adventure, whether it's published or not. We also have a section on random magic items, and I really, really like how the magic items are handled in this adventure. And we've come a long way from, for instance, Lost Mines of Phandelver or Tyranny of Dragons. So if you're familiar with those, or even the more recent adventures, all the way up to not including Curse of Strahd, because Curse of Strahd used a little bit of this innovation that we see in Storm King's Thunder, which is they don't spell out all the magic items for you. So if you look at Tyranny Dragons or Lost Mine of Phandelver, every time there's treasure, you're told exactly what's in that treasure. There's a wand of magic missiles. There's a +1 longbow. And you're given specific treasures. In this, sometimes you're given specific things. Sometimes the treasure will say, this is exactly what you find. But sometimes, instead, it won't spell out exactly what the magic items are, and instead it will say something like, roll twice on magic item table B in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So it's still telling you kind of what power level of magic item the characters get and how many they get. And they're telling you specifically what table in the DMG those items should come from, but it's up to you what the actual item is. So you could roll for that as a dungeon master, or you could have the player characters roll the dice and see what they get, or you could hand select something. Maybe I think in the adventure the example's given, maybe they need the ability to breathe underwater and there's not enough of that in the party. You could select some kind of magic item that'll help with breathing underwater that's found on that table. Or it's also suggested you could potentially let the player characters choose. And, I don't think I would do this with every treasure, but there are specific treasures in the adventure where it specifies choose an item from table B in the Dungeon Master's Guide, or let the player characters choose an item from this table. So I think that's pretty cool. And I think I'll come back to this a little later, but that's a great way if it makes sense in the story that maybe the actual character would have a choice. Like maybe you're dealing with some kind of a wizard who maybe has a bunch of magic items because he studies them. And so, potentially the wizard maybe has 20 magic items in his laboratory. And, so maybe the player character could choose one of those, right? Well, instead of coming up with 20 items and letting them choose one, you can just say, hey, you can choose anything from this particular table in the Dungeon Master's Guide. And it gives the player an ability, or I should say the players, because the whole group is choosing. There's only one item, but the whole group gets to choose what that item is. It gives them a chance to customize what kind of magic they have access to and what kind of items they have access to without breaking verisimilitude and in a way that makes sense. If you're not just doing this all the time and you're specifically doing it when it would make sense that there would be some element of choice involved. I really think that's cool. So not only is this a great way to handle magic items in a published adventure, but I think it's a great way to handle them in general. And it's showing you as a GM, here's how you can do this in your own game. And I really dig it. Now, of course, if a specific item is important to the story or the campaign, or it's something, the player characters are going to need a potion of water breathing or whatever, then those items are specified and those are given as specific treasures. But then there are a lot of times where it's like, just roll on this table and, give the PCs one item from this table, one item from that table, and 2 items from this other table. That kind of thing. I think that's really cool. I really like that. My favorite part of the show is when I hear from listener GMs like you. If you have feedback for the show, whether a comment on today's topic or an idea for a future topic or a comment on anything we've discussed on the show before, I would love to hear from you. And there are a lot of great ways that you can get a hold of me. You can email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter @LexStarWalker and on Google Plus +LexStarWalker. And finally, you can visit the website starwalkerstudios.com. You can find show notes for all the episodes there. You can find links to my Patreon page, my YouTube channel, and all kinds of great stuff. Finally, in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com, you can find a link to the Game Master's Journey Google Plus community. This is a great place to connect with other listener GMs, share thoughts and ideas, ask questions, things like that. Lately, we've had quite a few GMs sharing their homebrew worlds for D&D, which is super cool and really entertaining. And you can get a lot of great ideas for your world by reading what other GMs are doing with theirs. So you can find links and information about all this great stuff and more at starwalkerstudios.com. One cool chart that we're given in this is items in a giant's bag. So it's probably not a spoiler to tell you that the PCs are going to fight some giants in this campaign. And so this is a table of just random things you might find in a giant sack. So this is something that's going to be great to use all the time. Anytime your players encounter a giant, whether in this campaign or another, you've got this table you can use to have some cool things that they find that are just random things that this giant collected, which I really like flavor stuff like that. Another cool little bonus in this book is pixie dust. We have pixie dust described in the monster manual as far as it exists, and it's something that's worth money that people value, but we're not really given specific mechanics for it. This has specific mechanics for what pixie dust does, and it's pretty cool. You actually make a percentile roll, and you're not for sure what it's going to do every time you use it. There's a few different things it could do, and that's really cool. Really cool little bonus. So another cool innovation in this adventure is what are called special NPCs. So this is where the players actually play certain NPCs in a settlement. So there's a part of an adventure where the settlement is attacked and the PCs are helping to defend it. And in addition to playing their regular characters, they also play some of the NPCs that are in the settlement. The idea here is that this is supposed to make the players care more about what happens to the settlement and kind of get them further invested in this part of the story because they're playing NPCs. Now, I'll have to see, in play if that really works. I'm not convinced that that's the psychology there is really going to work and that's really going to make players care more about the settlement. But regardless of whether or not that actually works, I think this is a really cool idea, and I could see a lot of uses for this where you might have points in your story where it'd be really useful to have the players play some NPCs for a scene or two. So, for instance, you could use this as a way to show the players scenes that their characters aren't involved in, that their characters wouldn't know about, but for some reason you want the players to know about this. So you can do this by having them play NPCs in this other scene. So we see this in TV and movies where we have our heroes, and then maybe every once in a while we get a scene where we see something that the bad guys are doing. So you could do the same kind of thing in your D&D game, and when you want to do that scene where we see what the bad guys are doing, now the player characters are playing NPCs, the bad guys, basically, for a while. I think you could have a lot of fun with that. So in this specific adventure in Storm King's Thunder, part of the player's task when they're playing these NPCs is to keep them alive. And then at the end of the battle, when the battle's over, each of these special NPCs that survives the battle then has a quest that the player characters can undertake. These quests have rewards when they're completed, and usually the reward is in the form of one or more magic items or a substantial amount of gold, which is usually in the form of expensive gemstones. So this is a fantastic way to reward magic items. There's just so much goodness in this little special NPC thing packed in here. It's also a great way to give more specialized or more personalized items to your player characters because these items are given to them by an NPC. It's not just some random item that they find in some random treasure hoard somewhere. This item is a gift from a specific NPC. This is also a great motivator for player characters to explore side quests and side plots. So in a given game session, the PCs can decide if they want to follow the main story, the story quest, or if they want to investigate a side plot or perform a side quest for an NPC. If they go after the side quest or the side plot, then they're probably going to get some kind of a useful reward, either a significant amount of money or a useful magic item. I think these are great times to let PCs choose a specific item from a specific chart in the DMG if you want to do that. So if you want your player characters to be able to have some choice over the magic items they have, but you don't want to have them buying and selling magic items, this is a great way you could do it. Like I said, before, the example of maybe they do a favor for a wizard who researches and creates magic items. Well, it makes sense that that wizard would have a decent sized pool of magic items that he could give as a reward. So you could find a table in the DMG that has the right kind of items you're looking for and tell the player characters, hey, you can choose any one of these items. Or you could go a step further, take that table and hand select, a couple handfuls of items from it yourself and have them choose from that list. This is also a great time for you as a DM to introduce an item that you've hand selected for a specific character. Maybe you've created this item from scratch, or it's just an item that you think really fits a certain character, like a Holy Avenger for a Paladin. It can be really contrived feeling to find such a perfect item for your character in a random treasure hoard, like in a dragon's treasure hoard. It can feel really contrived. And I've been there on both sides of the screen where you kill this dragon and you find this item that's just perfect for your character. I've been there as a GM, I've been there as a player, and from both sides of the screen, it feels a little like, okay, I see what's going on here. The GM want me to have this. That's cool. And that's okay. It's not like going to ruin your game, but it does create this moment where we're thinking of this more in terms of a game and less in terms of a story. And I like to avoid things like that. So having that item instead be rewarded from an NPC for completing one of these quests makes a lot more sense. Maybe it's an item that the NPC created, or maybe it's an item that the NPC found while that NPC was adventuring, or maybe it's an item that the NPC was given by someone else, or something. Like, the thing is you can come up with a provenance for this item. Where is this item from? How did this NPC get this item? And why is the NPC giving it to the player characters? So it all makes sense in the story, and it's not just Deus Ex Machina. Oh, my paladin just happened to find a holy avenger in this dragon treasure hoard. Also, these side quests are a great way to pull in PC backgrounds, player character relationships with various NPCs, and things like that. And I just love the idea of giving a substantial reward for players following through and investigating these kinds of things. And Thomas Chapman was asking on the Google Plus community about ideas and ways to pull in player character backgrounds and things like that into an adventure. And that's a topic I'm going to cover in depth in a future episode. But, this is one way that you can do that, by having these side quests. So you can come up with an NPC that can give a side quest that is somehow related to a player character's background. And not only is that making that background relevant to the story and giving that player character some spotlight and some opportunity to explore that, but there's also going to be some kind of reward at the end for doing so. So it's a great way to get a needed magic item to the player characters, or some needed money so the dwarf can buy his full plate armor, that kind of thing. I think also these side quests, in a way, give the players a way that they can manage the difficulty of the campaign. How hard do they want it to be? So if you've got kind of this main story going that they're following, and maybe your players are a little bit worried about the next encounter, that they're not going to be able to handle it, then they could decide, hey, let's hold off on going and fighting the dragon right now. Let's instead follow through on some of these side quests and subplots that we've encountered, knowing that as we investigate those, chances are good that we're either going to get some more money and or some more magic items that will help us defeat the dragon, hopefully. Another new thing that we see in this adventure that I'm a big fan of is we have a section in the appendices called Linked Adventures. And what this is doing is it gives guidelines on how you can tie this adventure into one of the previous adventures put out by Wizards. So it includes Lost Mines of Phandelver, Hot DQ, or Hoard of the Dragon Queen, Uda, or Out of the Abyss, and Poda, or Plains of the Apocalypse, or Plains of the Apocalypse. Princes of the Apocalypse. Oh my God, I can't talk anymore. So, they talk about, hey, if you're playing Hoard of the Dragon Queen and you don't want to finish Hoard of the Dragon Queen and you want to transition into Storm King's Thunder, here are some thoughts on how to do that. And it goes pretty in depth into actually telling you, this NPC tells you this, it will lead you to that. And they do a really good job. It was a little disappointing to me because I'd heard about this ahead of time. And I thought what they were going to do is tell you, here's how to go into this after you've completed one of these other adventures. And since these other adventures, with the exclusion of Lost Mines of Phandelver, go to fairly high level, obviously that's not going to work. So instead, they're assuming that you started running, say, Out of the Abyss, and now Storm King's Thunder came out, and you haven't finished Out of the Abyss, and your players don't want to finish Out of the Abyss now. They want to go do Storm King's Thunder. So it tells you how you can do that. So I don't know like what percentage of DMs that's actually going to be at all helpful to. I'm glad that they made the effort to do it. It's pretty cool. And if nothing else, it gives you, it shows you some examples of how you can do something like that. But what I would really love to see in the future from Wizards is I'd like to see them do a future adventure that starts at, say, level 11 or level 15, basically where one of the previous campaigns ended, like Tyranny of Dragons or Princes of the Apocalypse or Curse of Strahd or Storm King's Thunder, and starts at that level and goes to level 20, so that it's like, okay, if you played one of our previous campaigns, this can be the next part of the campaign, and we'll take player characters to level 20. Part of that is just for all those groups out there that maybe did Out of the Abyss or Princes of the Apocalypse or Horde of the Dragon Queen, and they're like, well, what do we do now? We'd kind of like to keep playing these characters, but we finished the published campaign, and maybe the DM isn't comfortable coming up with his own stuff. And so it'd be really nice to have an adventure for that. And the other thing is we haven't seen any examples from Wizards on how to handle play beyond like 14th level. So I'd love to see an adventure from Wizards of here's how we do an adventure for level 15 to 20. So we have an example of that. So they can show us how it's done. So I think that would be super cool. Another cool thing that we get in this product is new giant options. And this is something else that I hope to see them, or I hope we see them continue to do this in future products, where they give some new special additional abilities for fire giants, cloud giants, hill giants, stone giants, and storm giants. And these are all really cool. And these are just some other thing that type of giant can do if you want it to be able to. So you could just use that for your giants in general. Just now all your fire giants can do this thing. Or maybe just special ones like uber powerful fire giants can do this. It's completely up to you whether you want to use this or not in this campaign or any campaign. But it's really cool. And I'd love to see more of this. You know, here's additional abilities that different types of monsters could have to make them more interesting or more varied or more powerful or more deadly or whatever. They also modify some monsters from the monster manual to make them more unique. For instance, there's a certain dragon that you encounter in the campaign who is just not an everyday version of that dragon. This one has additional things. For instance, this is a spellcasting dragon, so uses a spellcasting variant, and we are given spell lists for the dragon. But it also has some special abilities that just it can do that other dragons can't do. And that's really, really cool. So, you know, these modifications make these creatures more interesting and more deadly and more unique. We also see legendary versions of some standard monsters, which is also super cool. So maybe take something like a frost giant that normally isn't a legendary monster, but now we have a legendary frost giant that can do some things that normal frost giants can't do, including, of course, some legendary actions. Very awesome. And the last thing I'm going to talk today, this is a super cool innovation that, again, I hope we see in every adventure that Wizards puts out from now on, is monster rosters. So some of the areas in the adventure will have a monster roster. So let's say you're going to explore a cave system. This monster roster is a chart that shows all of the monsters and NPCs that are in that cave system, shows you how many of each there is, tells you what rooms they're in, and has a notes section for anything specific you need to know. And this is a fantastic way for the DM to be able to keep track of a facility where there is a set and finite number of specific monsters in that facility. Like, you know, this cave network has 100 goblins in it. And once those 100 goblins are gone, there are no more goblins. You know, a lot of adventures we see, there just seem to be infinite goblins. They just keep respawning as long as they're needed. But it's much more fun to say, no, there's this many goblins, and the PCs can slowly whittle those numbers down and use guerrilla warfare and attrition if they want to take care of these goblins. So this is just a great way to keep track of that, especially like a dungeon where you're going to have a lot of different types of creatures and all that, to have summarized in one spot where at a glance you can see these are all the monsters in the dungeon. This is how many of each there are. You can even keep track on that table as PCs encounter and kill monsters. Oh, this monster is gone. And also where they're at and any notes that you need to keep in mind about those monsters. Super cool. And I really hope we see this in all adventures from now on, because they all should have this. This is a great idea. So I plan to use something like this in my own adventures from now on, whether it's something I'm doing for myself or maybe for publication, to just help me run the game and keep track of what's going on and where are the PCs at, how many of these foes have they dealt with, how many are still out there. And again, I think this is a really great way to see at a glance what kind of an impact the PC's incursions on this facility have had so far. How far do they have to go? All right, well, that's going to wrap up episode 123 of Game Master's Journey. I just wanted to quickly go through some of this stuff in Storm King's Thunder that I was really impressed with. It probably be a little while before I can do the full review. I've still got to read through the whole book, and I've got a move going on right now. And I also have a bunch of other topics I need to cover in the near future. So I wanted to get this out, because this is fairly new product right now, and probably a lot of you are debating whether or not to get it. So here are some of the things you can get out of this above and beyond the adventure itself. So definitely worth checking out. And again, I will do a full review sometime in the future. So I hope that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music provided by Cloudwalker, Renfield, Stanko, Transboy, and Ish. Please see the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/GameMastersJourney.